Hello, welcome to Convergent Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very excited to share the conversation I had with Peter Bellwood. Peter is Emeritus Professor in Archaeology at the Australian National University. He has his PhD from King's College in Cambridge. His major research areas have been focused on population migrations during prehistory eras and the spread of Austronesian languages. He's the author of numerous books within archaeology, including his most recent book, The 5-Million-Year Odyssey, The Human Journey from Ape to Agriculture. And that's what we talk about in the conversation. We start by talking about kind of an overview of the 5 million year history of humans, the genera and species of humans and different types of humans that live together at the same time, genes from early human species, and this kind of 4 acts of human history that he details. We talk about hominins arising out of the Miocene period of the Earth. We talk about distinct features of Australopithecus, humans in the Pleistocene, Homo Erectus walking out of Africa, Neanderthals, and other human species. We also talk about domestication and cultivation of plants and animals in the Holocene, rice and corn in the Fertile Crescent and in China, Maize in the Western Hemisphere, Anatolian hypothesis for languages, and many other topics. I absolutely love this conversation. I loved his book. It's a kind of a one-stop shop for understanding our human history and our kind of connections to other periods and other humans at the same time at one point. But more importantly, I really like the second half of the book, which shows out of the Pleistocene into the Holocene, the importance of agriculture, importance of domestication, and even some of his work that he's done on languages and how we've spread over the earth. It's just such a wonderful, wonderful book. It's obviously well researched. It's very current. It's very balanced, honest, and he wades through different topics seamlessly. So it's a fabulous book. He was an absolute delight to talk with, and I really, really enjoyed this conversation. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversation at convergentdialogues.substack.com. I'm also on YouTube, so get over to both those places and subscribe, like, follow, write a review, share with your friends, tell everyone. And you can also feel free to contribute as well. Helps the podcast grow, so big thanks for that. And now I bring you Peter Bellwood. I am here with Peter Bellwood. Peter, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm greatly looking forward to our conversation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
You have written a marvelous book. It's called The 5-Million-Year Odyssey, The Human Journey from Ape to Agriculture. It's quite magnificent, and we're going to talk all about it. So before we do, why don't you tell listeners just who you are professionally, academically, and what you're currently up to?
Well, I was formerly a professor of archaeology at the Australian National University. I've retired now. As I was just saying, I've just entered my 80s, so I'm no longer involved in immediate teaching or administration. So nowadays, I like to write books about the human past and where we all come from. I am an archaeologist, as I said. I trained in archaeology in Cambridge University about 60 years ago. And I'm now trying to keep up, of course, with the huge explosion in modern science, genetics, linguistics, chronological sciences, you name it, paleontology, to give some ideas accessible to the general readership about where humans come from and what they've been up to in the last 5 million years or so.
Yeah. Well, it was one of the reasons I'm excited to talk with you, because from especially from your kind of primary field of study in archaeology, there's so many things still to contribute. And the first question I want to ask is what is this kind of a general kind of thesis here? Is what is the 5 million year odyssey of humans?
Yes,
and why that's important to really understand the kind of width and breadth of our story.
Well, humans are rather remarkable. According to geneticists and paleoanthropologists, people who study fossils and bones, the hominins, that is, human-like bipedal creatures, including Homo sapiens, but of course all the extinct hominins in the past. Hominins and chimpanzees and another little chimpanzee-like creature called the bonobo in Central Africa shared a common ancestor somewhere between, I think, 6 and 9 million years ago, according to geneticists, using molecular clock and other kinds of dating. Somehow, our bipedal ancestors, who originally must have lived in trees, came down into open sort of savanna-like territory and spread and kept on spreading throughout the whole world. And of course, we became upright, bipedal, tool-using, big brains, and all the rest of it. The chimpanzees and bonobos, remarkably, of course, they evolved their own way. They're not our ancestors, obviously. They're our cousins. They evolved a knuckle-walking habit that we see in many David Attenborough and other movies and things like that. And of course, they remained in equatorial Africa, close to the rainforest. They never spread at all, as far as anyone knows. They've pretty much always been where they are now. Of course, apes were much more widespread millions of years ago, but certainly chimpanzees and bonobos have not spread in the way that humans have. So we've spread, we've migrated. So that is the remarkable story about humans. By 16,000 years ago, humans had reached the southern tip of the Americas. They were somewhere down around Tierra del Fuego, having migrated there all the way from Africa, of course, as the original homeland, and of course, Tasmania, southern Australia. Humans went everywhere except for the Antarctica and places that are not inhabitable.
Right.
But chimpanzees and bonobos went their own way in a quite different direction. And of course, we now have at least 5 or 6 million years of evolution and development separate from the great apes. And behind us are many species that we presume to be extinct, Australopithecines, Neanderthals, although what is happening nowadays, of course, is that geneticists are showing that sometimes some of these species were quite capable of breeding with our own Homo sapiens ancestors, and that does change the whole picture. Now, how separate were these species that paleoanthropologists recognize in the past? Anyway, so that's
that's great. We have this incredible journey from so long ago, and when we think about in the big picture of how many species of various animals are on the planet, both extinct and currently living, and then you see our Homo sapiens. So it's very interesting, our history. So let's talk about kind of taxonomy here, right? Because this stuff's always really fascinating to me. So let's break it down a little bit. So first, what is the difference between genera and species? And then how many human species were there and how many at one time? So here you can talk about Denisovans, Homo erectus, sapiens, Neanderthals, the whole bit.
Well, of course, genera are families of species, related species that are presumed to have shared a common origin. Whereas species, well, I suppose that most people would have the view that a species is something that breeds, with its own members and not outside its own boundaries. But of course, we do have horses and donkeys who can reproduce mules, and dogs and jackals can reproduce lions and tigers. Sometimes the offspring are fertile. They're not in the case of mules. There aren't any fossil mules, as far as I know. But other chimpanzees and bonobos, which live across north and south of the Congo River, they became separate maybe a couple of million years ago. They can still interbreed, apparently. But they do it in zoos, of course. They don't do it in the wild because they don't live in the same place and they don't have the same ways of life in many cases. So they don't come into contact. But in the case of horses and donkeys, of course, once humans domesticated them and moved them around in the Middle East and Egypt, then they started to breed. And so mules appeared. Now, it is now clear from ancient DNA that hominins, at least within the last sort of 100 or 200,000 years, were capable of interbreeding. The Neanderthals, the Denisovans that you mentioned in Central Asia, and early Homo sapiens, still a bit, early Homo sapiens is rather uncertain. It existed genetically, but fossils that we can say are directly ancestral to us are very hard to find until about 50,000 years ago. There are some in Africa and Europe that date as far back as 300,000 years ago, but they've always got cranial features that sort of make them overlap with more archaic kinds of hominins. So that is a very difficult area. And ancient DNA at the moment, I think the oldest examples come from a site in Spain, in a location called Atapuerca, where some remarkable hominins were somehow fell down a shaft and died in this cave about 400,000 years ago, believed to be ancestral Neanderthals. But that is the oldest ancient DNA recovered. Before that, for the past almost 5 million years, of course, ancient DNA has not yet been recovered. But, basically, these species, like Neanderthals and Denisovans, are defined, well, mostly from fossils. Denisovans are defined from DNA rather than fossils, ancient DNA. And it is a great mystery. Were they really integrated and interbreeding around the edges, or were they totally separate from each other? Nobody really knows that. It used to be thought that humans or hominins spread through the world and remained together through what is called gene flow. The neighbors all mix and everything spreads, so that only one species existed at one time. And then a little later, of course, the idea came that everyone came out of Africa, that is Homo sapiens, and replaced all the more ancient species. Now we're in a kind of middle ground where certainly people came out of Africa and certainly people spread, but also they probably never completely separated from each other. And that does make it quite complicated.
So how many at one time? So Homo sapiens have been around for a while.
Yeah.
There was one point, right? It's as best we know now. At one point that there was different groups of what we'll call humans, right?
Yeah.
Homo sapiens of us that were different species of humans, if you will, were living on the planet at the same time. So it wasn't just us, Homo sapiens, but also Neanderthals and maybe Denisovans and maybe others.
Yes.
How many do we think were living together at the same time?
Well, I think at one point in my book, during what is called the Middle Pleistocene era, I counted 11, I think. Obviously, I don't have time to go into all of these, but maybe 200,000 or 300,000 years ago, Neanderthals, Denisovans, late survivors of Homo erectus in Indonesia, early Homo sapiens. Early Homo sapiens is very much, of course, just a genetic concept. Geneticists tell us that Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, and Denisovans all shared a common ancestor maybe 600,000 years ago, probably located in Africa. But no one's actually found that ancestor as a fossil skull. It's all assumptions from DNA molecular clocks and so forth. So there's some sort of sapiens lineage that must go back at least as a separate entity, I suppose, for 600,000 years, somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa. But there is a great deal of debate as to where it might have been, and it might have been quite widespread.
Yeah, it's very interesting because when we look at whatever there's 8 billion humans on the planet, it's so interesting because we'll look out into nature and we'll say, well, there's this amount of species of beetles or wild cats or whatever, but there's only one human species as far as we know is still living. It's such an interesting way to think about other types or other species of humans living together at the same time. There's only us now, and we're used to that. But it'd be so interesting to think about other similar or human-like, animals like us, kind of, walking around and inhabiting the Earth still, which would be really fascinating.
Well, of course, there is only us now, but don't forget that many of us who live in Europe and Asia carry a small amount of Neanderthal DNA.
Sure.
I mean, not much. There wasn't that much intermarriage. Interbreeding, I suppose, or mixing, whatever you want to call it, admixture, I think geneticists call it. Same with Denisovans, as a little bit of their DNA does survive in people in the Western Pacific, New Guinea, indigenous Australians and so forth, only small again. And some Neanderthal DNA was carried back to Africa by later. I mean, Africans originally did not have Neanderthal DNA because Neanderthals developed, of course, in Asia and probably in the Middle East, in the Levant. So we do carry some traces of these earlier species. Yeah, they're still within us. And maybe we probably, I'm sure, well, we must somewhere carry, of course, genes that are inherited from Australopithecines 4 million years ago. I'm not qualified to say what they are, but geneticists, no doubt, are considering these things.
Yeah, it's very interesting to think about. So you divide the book, as you say, there's just kind of these 4 acts, right? Which is really interesting. So Act 1 is hominins before Homo, which is 6 to 2.5 million years ago. And then we get to Act 2, and that's genus Homo to Homo sapiens, 2.5 million to 300,000 years ago. Act 3 is Homo sapiens to then food production, 300,000 to 12,000 years ago. And finally, Act 4, age of food production, 12,000 years ago to the present. So maybe just kind of give us the broad arc of these 4 acts.
And of course, many people nowadays would say that there is actually an Act 5, which is being called the Anthropocene, but I won't go into that.
Right.
But,
right. It's a little controversy, I understand.
Well, of course, I tend to look at the past in terms of successions of events that had major impact on what followed. I think we can. A lot of anthropologists have made this point. When we look at the past, when we look at the period we're in now, you sometimes see periods of very rapid change, and then periods when things quieten down for a long time, and then you get rapid changes again. So I tend to look at these rapid changes. The beginnings of agriculture in different parts of the world, of course, produced very massive rapid changes because the very sharp increases in population. But that is in very recent time. The first act, well, that is the one that basically we associate with the Australopithecines and their other species like the Ardipithecus in Ethiopia, between 5 and 2 million years ago. Small brains, but certainly bipedal. The Lucy, the hominin found in East Africa many years ago, was just over 1 meter tall, I think, and had bipedal posture like we do. A very small brain, probably only 1/3 of the size of our brain. And by about 2 million or 2.5 million years ago, brain sizes were increasing. They seem to have increased, well, from what we know of the chronology, fairly sharply. I mean, from, say, 400 to 700 cubic centimeters or something like that in 500,000 years, which, when you're dealing in 5 or 6 million years, is quite rapid. And paleoanthropologists agree amongst themselves, of course, according to their statistical methods of analyzing crania and so forth, that the changes that occurred about 2 to 2.5 million years ago are sufficiently important to recognize a new genus, which is called Homo. And that is, the Homo genus, of course, contains all the later species, Neanderthals, Homo erectus, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens. That is the beginning of the era of Homo. And about 2 million years ago, a species that's usually termed Homo erectus by paleoanthropologists left Africa, presumably through the Levant or Arabia, probably doing so during a period of interglacial, warm and wet climate with a very widespread African monsoon, and then migrated into Asia. The third one, of course, well, that is, I start that 300,000 years ago, when paleoanthropologists first claim that some fossils found in Africa and especially in the Middle East and in Greece can be claimed as ancestral Homo sapiens. There's a lot of argument about this because it is not possible to be certain that these were ancestors of modern humans. The main expansion of modern humans out of Africa appears to have taken place about 50,000 years ago. In terms of archaeology, maybe 55,000 years ago. In terms of the settlement of Australia, for instance, in terms of the archaeological record in Europe, in terms of molecular clocks with modern DNA, let's say 55,000 years ago. But there are fossils like Homo sapiens that are older than that date, but it's uncertain because no DNA has been recovered from them, so it's uncertain where they fit within the story. But anyway, that Act 3 is the one that I think, or I relate to Homo sapiens, its origins as far as they can be traced in Africa, and then it spread. And then, of course, Act 4, as the Earth warmed after the last glaciation, about 12,000 years ago, human populations, hunter-gatherer populations then began to grow in numbers. And somehow, somebody, well, or many people, and quite how this was done has never been 100% clear. They worked out that if you manage plants and animals in certain ways and plant them and select what you replant the next season, you can eventually domesticate them. You can change them genetically so that they carry characteristics that are very helpful for reducing them and increasing the amount of food you're creating. We call that agriculture. And it is important to me. Agriculture is a very important aspect of human life. Not everyone developed it at European contact in, let's say, 1492, which is a major date when Christopher Columbus went to the Caribbean. There were still many hunter-gatherers all over North America, probably half the area of North America, including most of Canada and the West, California. The people were still hunting and gathering. They were all over Australia. Not everybody became a farmer, even if they have done so nowadays. But before 1492, the hunter-gatherers were still occupying very large areas of the world. So that is why I really picked those 4 acts, each one marked by a kind of cluster of events that I see as having major impact on what came later.
Yeah, absolutely. So the obvious question that comes after this is, well, how did hominins arise? So just for listeners, you have the Earth, which is 4 billion years old, and there's all these different epochs, if you will. We have the Precambrian. Obviously, we have the Cambrian explosion, various extinction periods. You get all the way to Jurassic and Jurassic period, another extinction. So really, you start us and dump us in the Miocene, which really on the large scale of life on Earth, it's really recent, right? If you're talking about 4 billion years, even the Cambrian, 500 million years, the Jurassic, 66 million years, 5 million is still relatively not that long ago. But where do we see? Obviously, we talk about this common ancestor, things like that. But in the Miocene and then into the Pliocene, where do we start to see that there's a beginning of hominins that is different? I guess.
Okay. Well, of course, the great apes, as we call them, and their ancestors, apes were very widespread in the world in the Miocene. Now, I'm not an expert on apes, but they were all over Europe and Asia and Africa, not in America or Australia, of course, but certainly the old world, as we call it. They had a huge radiation, and the oldest bipedal creatures have actually recently been claimed from a site in Germany. I think they're about 12 million years old. There is some debate as to whether they could have been hominin ancestors. It's not resolved. And most people, I think, probably prefer an African origin. So the great apes did have a kind of an era of florescence in the Miocene, but then, of course, they began to shrink, and humans gradually took over the ape world, especially with Australopithecines and the genus Homo. How did we separate from? Well, in the case of chimpanzees and bonobos, the general story given is that they, about 2 million years ago, some of them somehow managed to cross the Congo River. I gather they're not strong swimmers. And the ones that crossed to the south then evolved separate from the others to the north into what we call bonobos today. So separation. Now, did early hominins separate from early chimpanzees and bonobos? Well, and if they must have done in some way. Yeah, there has to be some genetic separation to allow a species to form. And but quite how it happened, I know some geneticists like the idea that it was a long-term thing, that they would separate and then maybe come back for a while, then separate again, and gradually get more different. So eventually they have different behavioral characteristics. They live in different environments. And by, well, let us say, I think it's 7 million years ago, there is a finding in the Central Sahara in Chad, bones that have been called Sahelanthropus that are thought by many people to be the first bipedal hominins. They would have lived there, of course, when the Central Sahara was somewhat wetter than it is now. The Sahara at various times was much wetter than now and did have vegetation and grazing animals and so forth, even 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, just before the start of Egyptian civilization. The Sahara went through a wet phase and people spread through it. So that is probably what happened, that there was a gradual separation. And then once, the oldest definite hominins that everybody agrees upon, I suppose, are really the Australopithecines.
Yeah.
They start about 4.5 million years ago in South Africa and East Africa. And from then on, I think everybody agrees that somewhere within the Australopithecine mix was the ancestral population that gave rise to, eventually, to hominins, to Homo, to the genus Homo.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, you mentioned that there's the Ardipithecus, and then you have Australopithecus, right? There's this kind of
Australopithecus, yeah. Australopithecus, yeah.
And the difference is that they're bipedal, they have larger brains, opposable thumbs, a larynx for speech, maybe, and they're hairless. Is this really the features that make them distinct?
Well, it does. I mean, they don't actually. The Ardipithecus and the Australopithecines don't really have much larger brains than chimpanzees. But they are bipedal. The bipedalism is the crucial thing. I think that's being bipedal, but then frees your hands. See, we can oppose now. Apes can't do this. Apes are great for climbing trees and grasping, but an ape couldn't play a violin. I mean, put it that way. Humans can create things with fingers and thumbs. We're opposable thumbs and fingers. That's very important. And brain size, well, yes, that increased more slowly. That probably began to increase with Homo around about 2.5 years ago. So things develop at different speeds and times and in different places. Although all of it is, of course, in sub-Saharan Africa somewhere. I think that is where everything happened.
Is there? You talk about the Rift Valley for having this environment where these things can be fostered. So you can chat about that, but I guess is it possible with Australopithecus that it's maybe that they were a type of intermediary were they fully bipedal, or were they somewhat in trees but then also on the ground, or was it completely bipedal on the ground? Do we have any of that?
Well, that is a question that that's the question for a paleoanthropologist, I think. I mean, were they in my book, of course, there is, which I courtesy of a paleoanthropologist called Milford Woolpoth from the University of Michigan, who has written important textbooks about biological anthropology. I do have a little picture of Lucy reconstructed side by side with a contemporary Homo sapiens. I'm just looking for it at the moment. Sorry. And you can see from it, it is here. Yes, you can see from this, Lucy is this little one here. This is a 2 million year old Homo member of the genus Homo on the other side. Lucy was very small. She was bipedal, standing upright, grasping hands, a very small brain, still about ape size, but definitely hominin. The other question is, did these little Australopithecines, did they make stone tools? That's always been a mystery. It's probably possible that they did, because their bones are found in sites in southern Africa where stone tools do occur. But usually it's always uncertain whether it's Australopithecines or contemporary populations of Homo who were actually making the stone tools. That's always been slightly uncertain. I suspect the later Australopithecines did make stone tools, the ones that overlapped in time with the genus Homo. And stone tools, of course, are a crucial part of our evolution. They were the original, stone tools and organic materials like spears and slings to carry babies because the genus Homo was hairless and babies couldn't cling onto mother's hair. Tools in many ways did make us human. Yes, they allowed us to create many, many things beyond our bodies that were of great importance.
Yeah, I think it's an essential thing to, I guess, to remember is that, obviously, maybe sometimes we might think that, well, there's one day there's not a human, and then there is a human, and obviously there's a lot of again, evolution, right? These things are happening, but it seems what makes it distinct from what it was, or what it was evolving from, was this notion of being bipedal. That this was a really distinct feature.
That is the crucial thing. Bipedal is the start. Yes. Yeah. Somehow, little creatures in trees became bipedal. Even when they were climbing in the trees, they could still stand on branches rather than swinging on them, if you like. Yeah, it means standing and walk. This is the one idea, is that standing and walking around on branches developed with early hominins. Then eventually, of course, they come down to the ground more and more. And eventually, I suppose, they'd leave trees altogether and go and live in much more open savanna landscapes, which are also very widespread in sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah, yeah. So then you take us to the important Pleistocene, and then obviously the current, or sort of current Holocene eras of geological Earth. And so many people have done this. So you break it down into early, middle, late Pleistocene, and there's key elements in each stage. So you can chat about those. You can mention the...
Well, these, of course, are Earth science divisions based on changes in the orientation of the Earth's atmospheric field, the Earth's field, relative positions of north and south and so forth. Also fossil records and fossils from deep sea cores, pollen. The Pleistocene, I think the main thing about the Pleistocene is that although it has early, middle and late phases that are very handy for classifying things in terms of chronology, it's the main events in the Pleistocene were these huge cycles caused by the movements of the Earth going around the sun, its orbit and the tilt of its axis. A lot of this, I think, to do is apparently connected with gravitational pull of other planets in the solar system. I'm not an astronomer, but
these are the Milankovitch
cycles, as they've become called, and they're related to the formation of ice ages. And in the early Pleistocene, say 2 million years ago, the swings were not very emphasized. Apparently, the cycles were mostly about 40 or 50,000 years long. But during the last million years, the Earth has been going through these rather more marked swings from glacial or ice age, if you like, to periods like now, interglacials, on cycles of about 100 or 120,000 years. And it is during this time that the larger-brained hominins like Neanderthals and the later Homo erectus, and of course the ancestors of Homo sapiens, it's during this time that they evolved. And it was during the glacial periods when they would have had access to land bridges because sea levels dropped. And of course, North America and Asia were joined together, as were Australia and New Guinea during the glacial low sea level periods. But also in the interglacial periods, the opposite of the glacials, periods like now, many of the great deserts, like the Sahara and Arabia, were much wetter. Now, the Sahara is a very dry place now, but as I said before, 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, it was much wetter, and people were living in caves and small hilly areas right through the center of it. And so these interglacials, of course, allowed people to leave Africa and spread into Asia about 2 million years ago. So it is these swings from glacial to interglacial that are the most important aspect of the Pleistocene in terms of understanding human evolution.
Now one of the hominids is most fascinating for me is the Homo erectus, which I think still think was the first to walk up out of Africa and go throughout the earth. But in your book, you made an interesting point that maybe I've either missed before or maybe it's the first time hearing it, was that it wasn't one time. It was a back and forth kind of thing, right? That they would that multiple times coming and going or whatever. Talk about Homo erectus getting out of Africa.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you see, if there was if there were opportunities for leaving Africa, say every 100,000 years during warm, wet interglacial periods, we wouldn't really know about it because there wouldn't be 100,000 years is not enough for deep level speciation. Each group would be very similar to the preceding ones, and they'd probably interbreed freely, so that we wouldn't see it in the fossil record. And since there's no DNA from the Middle Pleistocene, well, at least not from the time period we're talking about, moving out of Africa, we don't really know this yet. So Homo erectus is said by many to have been, because that's the one that got to Java and China, maybe 1.5, 2 million years ago. However, from a site in Georgia, which I have visited, a site called Domestication, a number of fossils were found some years ago. They're about 1.7 million years old. And there has been quite a lot of debate as to whether these are Homo erectus or some other species. I'm not an authority on this, I can't, but in other words, there's a possibility that one or two species left Africa. And there might have been continuous, not quite continuous movements. Movements would have been, I suppose, pinned down into interglacial periods, although we don't know, of course, if they went by land through the Sinai Peninsula or somehow got across the mouth of the Red Sea, across the Bab el-Mandab. We'll probably never know that. It is that is impossible to know. But certainly people did get through, and maybe on many occasions, whether it was a single species, Domestication and Homo erectus could be different species, according to some people. Writing a number of papers being written now are giving this opinion. So it is quite complex. And don't forget also that in the case of Indonesia, some of these early hominins somehow managed to reach the island of Flores and also the island of Luzon in the Philippines sometime, probably in the early or middle Pleistocene, and they became completely isolated and very small in body size, and they are now thought to be extinct, probably surviving until the arrival of Homo sapiens about 50,000 years ago.
I wanted to ask about Homo floresiensis. Now, is it enough to know? Maybe we just don't know, but can we say that they're distinctly different, or is there debate on that? And then also, there's all these, difficult, eyewitness accounts that maybe they're still somewhere out in real, remote areas in Indonesia or something like that, and that they died off, a couple hundred years ago, maybe, or even sooner. That's kind of almost feels like a tall tale of sorts. But what do you think about these?
Well,
things?
I don't think they survived till. I know there are talks about small people in Flores, and there are some short people alive in Flores today. But I don't think anyone has ever demonstrated that they descend from Homo Floresiensis, as it's called, or commonly known as the Hobbit. The cave that the woman was found in, the skeleton of Homo Floresiensis, was excavated early in the 2000s and the late 1990s. The skeleton at the time was thought to be about 12,000 years old from radiocarbon dating, but then the excavators discovered that they misinterpreted the stratigraphy in the cave, and many of the deposits had moved and been replaced. And now they think that that species lived between, was extinct by, let's say, 50 or 60,000 years ago, probably disappeared when modern humans arrived. And there are traces of it in other sites in Flores back to, current dating about 300,000 years ago, but chronology is always a problem here. But it might have arrived as much as 1 million years ago. There are people who think that it is a separate movement from Africa of a very small hominin. How one explains that, I really don't know, but separate from Homo erectus and probably even separate from the Domanici remains, the Domanici hominins, in which case we could have 3 or more species coming out of Africa. But this is a period of great mystery, I have to say, disagreement. And I don't know if we will ever know completely, because, of course, the fossil record is very fragmentary, and it's very lucky to find anything. I mean, since Homo Floresiensis was found in 2000, and I think it was published in 2003, 20 years ago, people have been looking all over the place in caves, and they haven't found any more. But they have, of course, found a similar one in Luzon Island in the northern Philippines, but not in Indonesia so far. Well, not as far as I know. If they have, they haven't yet published it or reported it.
Yes, it's very interesting how there's obviously more to discover, and then it reshifts things, and you'll see a paper come out, and we'll say, well, actually, maybe we push this date back more. Or, no, we push it up further. It's always in flux.
Chronology is a difficult issue, because most dating, of course, has error ranges, and anything, soil, fossils, can be moved and redeposited, and this is what happened with Homo Floresiensis. And there's a problem with the fossils in Java of Homo erectus. They're found in sediments, and the sediments can be roughly dated, but that doesn't mean to say that the fossils are exactly the same date. They might have a quite different kind of history. And this is can cause big problems.
So then we get to us, to Homo sapiens. You talk about this. It's been a little time here, I guess, because it's about us as much as we know. It's about this multi-regional model and this replacement model, such as the African Eve model, the origins of Homo sapiens. What do we know as much as we do? I mean, obviously, you mentioned gene flow earlier. You don't have to talk about that, but what do we know about our origins of Homo sapiens for us as humans?
Well, I think the origins of Homo sapiens have to be in sub-Saharan Africa, and there are a number of fossils from there that might fit the bill. But as I said before, many of them also have features of the shapes of the skull that overlap with other kinds of archaic hominins. In other words, some of the ones found in Israel, for instance, that are classified as Homo sapiens, the back of the skull is still very much the same or similar in shape to the skulls of Neanderthals, for instance. So there's all gradual. I mean, there's no sharp change. What we can say, I think, is that in terms of modern humans like us, we've got this globular cranium that's wider above the ears. With ancient hominins, the cranium was usually quite low, and the widest point was more or less at the ears, but our cranium is wider a little bit higher up. We have a globular cranium. Now, human remains, skeletons, crania, with our modern shape are, I guess, in general, less than 55,000 years old. Anything older than that, and there are Homo sapiens fossils older than that in Israel, as I said, in Greece, and of course Africa and Europe, they tend to retain more of these archaic characteristics. So which ones are ancestral to us? In Africa, I suppose there has been continuity amongst the population still living in southern Africa. The people, Bushmen and the Khoikhoi herders and hunter-gatherers in Tanzania and also in the Congo rainforest, many of them have DNA records that suggest great antiquity within Africa. They descend from the initial Homo sapiens populations in southern Africa. But then, I suppose 55,000 years ago or something like that, people then spread out of Africa and through Europe and Asia. The oldest claims now for modern Homo sapiens like us in Europe are, I think, 54,000 years ago from a cave site in the Rhone Valley in France, where archaeologists have found stone tools and a tooth that they believe are associated with Homo sapiens in layers stratified amongst the stone tools left by Neanderthals, which suggests that humans had probably just come out of Africa at that time and were in the Middle East mixing with Neanderthals to some extent.
Mm. So the time frame we can say is definitely 50,000 years, maybe 54, but maybe give me that confidence interval. Where are we at? What's the oldest and what's the youngest, I guess, for Homo sapiens generally?
Yes. Well, there are, of course, a number of people who are claiming older dates now from the human remains found in caves, usually single teeth or fragments of crania found in Southeast Asian and Chinese caves. I'm not always convinced by those because I know that cave deposits can be very difficult to date and they can be disturbed and redeposited. There are claims for Australia that are very popular now in the Australian media that somebody got here 65,000 years ago. Those dates are on sand grains rather than stone tools or human remains. They're from a cave in the Northern Territory. And I think that for various reasons, this becomes quite complicated, but the kinds of stone tools that they're found with, which are axes with polished edges, are somewhat younger than this date. In other words, I'm not convinced by the 65,000. Geneticists tell us at least possibly 55,000, and I think for the time being, I would go along with that. And taking into consideration the archaeological record, of course, in Southeast Asia and Europe and Asia in general, there are no clear-cut agreed signs of a Homo sapiens presence until about 50 to 55,000 years ago. Anywhere else except in Australia, and as I mentioned, a few cases of finds from caves in Southeast Asia.
Yeah. This is very interesting. So 50,000 always sounds about right. Now,
of course, that is also the limited radiocarbon dating, which may be
sure.
There could be older dates, but people are not finding them in large numbers, and this is what concerns me somewhat.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you about this link between, we chatted about it earlier, just kind of the general view, so you can, dive deeper a little bit on here if you want. We don't have to spend a whole lot of time on it, but, so obviously if Homo sapiens are becoming this, distinct enough to be, own species, humans are on the planet, we have Neanderthals, and then we obviously have Denisovans. Now, there was a book that came out a couple of years ago now, Kindred. Why am I forgetting her name? It's by a woman.
Yes, about Neanderthals. Yes.
About Neanderthals.
Yes.
Yes. It's a great book. And she really looks at, it's kind of like, people have this idea of Neanderthals as the dumb caveman, but really that's not true at all. And it was a great book. She did fabulous research. And so maybe tell us about this as much as you know or want to speak on about this link between this association between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. I mean, at first it was thought that they just wiped them out, but then it looks more like it was a lot of interbreeding, and then they, just eventually became into what we now know as, parts of us. So what was that link there between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, and even also the link between Homo sapiens and Denisovans?
Yeah. Well, of course, the genetic story now is that Homo sapiens, Neanderthals and Denisovans shared a common ancestry in Africa, maybe 600,000 years ago. The ancestors of Homo sapiens at that time stayed in Africa, and a population ancestral to both Neanderthals and Denisovans migrated through the Levant, through Southwest Asia, into Europe and Asia, maybe 400,000 years ago. And the bones of some of those people, early Neanderthals, have been found in this site called Cima de los Huesos, the shaft where many bodies were apparently thrown down or fell in about 400,000 years ago. So modern humans and Neanderthals, or their ancestors at least, parted company about 400,000 years ago. The Neanderthals went to Eurasia and evolved there. Denisovans went further into Central Asia, it appears, into Siberia, probably Southeast Asia, and developed into yet another species. There are also fossil remains from China that may belong to even yet other species. That this is all becoming quite complicated So humans and Neanderthals have been separate for, say, 400,000 years. But then, let's say 55,000 years ago, the humans in the form of modern Homo sapiens then migrated into Europe and Asia and met the Neanderthals. I mean, this is what happened time and time again through human prehistory. Different populations develop in relative isolation from each other, and then one of them moves. For some reason, one of them finds a way out of a homeland, either a land bridge or a warm and wet climate through a desert or a river and whatever, and they then meet their deep cousins back in time, and the intermixing starts again. And that is what happened with Neanderthals. I think the general assumption with Neanderthals is that their population size was quite small. Of course, they made stone tools, quite complex ones. They knew how to use fire. And there are some arguments that the later ones, perhaps the ones that overlapped with Homo sapiens, didn't know how to build stone structures in caves, and sometimes even make hand stencils or hand impressions in red ochre on cave walls. I'm not sure about this. It's very difficult to date this kind of artistic material, but it is quite possible that the later Neanderthals were mixing with Homo sapiens and borrowing many of their ideas and habits. But the modern humans, as I understand the genetics, were larger in number. They had larger family sizes, and they were probably also, in the case of Europe, they developed eventually, of course, much more efficient kinds of stone tools, which archaeologists call Upper Paleolithic. These are things like blades and flake spear points and things like that nature.
Yeah. And what about when we see these links, you mentioned this aspect of, well, the Homo sapiens, they come out of Africa, and then there's this, spread into Asia and the Mideast that we know today. And so jumping ahead a little bit of sorts, I guess, I'm very curious. I've actually talked to a few people on the podcast about this. How do we understand humans really spreading across the globe? Of course, this is later, although people keep pushing and moving this date earlier and later. But they get to the Americas, and they get to Asia, right? They get to Australia, and then but also the Americas too. What's this story here of how we understand as best we can how through time and what time period where Homo sapiens got to the Americas?
Yes, I mean, I think, of course, once people get access to another region, and once the story gets out in a way, it's going to magnify itself. So it is like, I think, with even with the settlement of Polynesians, for instance, it goes in rapid bursts. You get periods when all of a sudden people discover that there are islands somewhere over the horizon, and in a very short time, large numbers of them move, and lots of new islands are settled. It tends to be very quick. And in the case of humans moving out of Africa, I suppose they were entering territories where food supplies would have been good. They would not have had the benefit that the first hominins would have had of having large numbers of naive animals that had never faced bipedal predators before. Modern humans would not have had this advantage because, of course, there were earlier hominins in Europe and Asia before them. But even so, they appear to have spread pretty quickly by at least 40, 50,000 years ago into cold areas of Central Asia. By 30,000 years ago, they'd spread up to the Arctic Circle in northern Russia. And of course, as we know, well, this is an argument. This is an issue of debate also, but in my view, around 16,000 years ago, they, by this time, of course, they developed warm clothing, methods of keeping themselves alive in very cold climates, warm clothing, boats, specialized hunting equipment, and so forth. and these things enabled them to reach the Americas.
Mm.
So I think things come in bursts, and that suddenly opportunities arise, and Neanderthals probably didn't face any opportunities, but Homo sapiens did as it entered new environments. I think with Neanderthals, as far as we know, there was no purposeful extermination. It was probably partly interbreeding. But one thing that I am aware of, and this is from my experience of living in Australia, when Europeans came here in the 19th century and, of course, dispossessed the Aboriginal population, they brought in diseases, but they also took the land for sheep farming. The same thing happened, of course, in the Americas. The indigenous population shrank in numbers, and birth rates declined dramatically. And I know this also happens as a result of competition amongst birds. I've seen articles on this. And when birds are in strong competition, the species that is on the downside tends to reduce its birth rate. And I think this might have happened with Neanderthals. Pressure from modern humans might have led them to reduce their birth rate until the point where they just eventually disappeared and became no longer able to support a continuing population. 45,000 years ago or something like that. And the same presumably happened with the Denisovans further east, although less is known.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, many people make a deal about the Bering Land Strait and even that there was, different, 16, 20,000 years ago. And after the ice wall in Canada, kind of broke through, then they were able to come down, although then it's hard to find, with timing of it beforehand. And some people think on the coast, on the Pacific, and all these different ideas, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
But so, Homo sapiens start populating the Earth, and we finally get to where you talk about much of the book is the Holocene, which again is our current period. If some people might think it's a new period, but we'll leave that on the table. And we really get you kind of alluded to it earlier. Domesticated plants and animals, or animal food, I should say, in the Holocene, right about 10,000 years BC.
Yeah.
That really was a huge change for just humans. And so could you talk about that and this difference and or similarity between cultivation and domestication?
Yeah. Well, first of all, of course, we know agriculture was very important from, at least 2 or 3 sources of data. The archaeological record, of course, people started living in many parts of the world in villages, much denser, larger populations. We know from DNA, ancient DNA, and from the archaeology that there were massive changes. Hunter-gatherer cultures were replaced by farming cultures, and different people, often with different body shapes. I mean, this can be as not just DNA, but especially in Europe and Eastern Asia, there were dramatic changes and very serious replacements of population from DNA records. Now, to be a farmer, in my view, you have to have some sort of domestication idea. Hunter-gatherers in Australia and North America and California, that is, hunter-gatherers before European contact, they all knew how to plant. If you put a seed in the ground, of course, it's going to grow. That's an obvious thing. And also, if you tame an animal and keep it around your campsite, it will probably be friendly and you can feed it. And that I think that happened very early on with dogs, for instance, that they were domesticated long before things like sheep and goats and cattle. Dogs are an extremely ancient domesticated animal, probably originally amongst hunter-gatherer populations, because dogs are very useful. They can bark, they can help hunting and so forth. Now, hunter-gatherers have this knowledge, and there's nothing unusual or special about it. They can manage their environments, they can use fire, they can burn to encourage regrowth of crops, but they don't domesticate. Now, domestication is genetic change. With crops, it's often the grains get bigger, they stay together on the ear for longer, they're easier to harvest, easier to thresh. with animals, it's changes in body shape, in docility, and things of that nature. Humans who are farming know how to encourage these developments by, presumably, I wouldn't say selective breeding, but they weren't stupid. They must have known that some animals had more useful characteristics than others, and the same with plants. Some kinds of wheat or barley, perhaps, they would see if fields were, if the grains didn't shatter and blow away when they were ripe, they might deliberately use them for replanting. So once this gets started, it becomes like a snowball. As these plants become more domesticated, of course, they become more productive, and so it goes on. And if you think about it, the world today that we live in now, a very small number of major species domesticated very, very early on, like wheat and barley and rice and maize, and of course the animals, sheep, cattle, pigs, chickens, although chickens are a little different because they're from southern China, Southeast Asia. But all of these creatures and plants, they still feed the world today. Millions of people live on products of maize, wheat, and rice, especially, and chicken and beef, and so forth. The areas where these plants were first and animals were first domesticated, like the Fertile Crescent for wheat and cattle, China for rice, Mesoamerica and South America for maize. They eventually became the sites of what we call ancient civilizations. This is not coincidence. I mean, for me, the Middle East, the Fertile Crescent, including Egypt, China, Mesoamerica, Peru, as we all know, if you're interested in ancient civilizations, well, those are the places to go and look for them. These very, very important crops and animals, they define these major areas of the world where the ancient civilizations developed. And that is not coincidence. It is because those areas were very lucky. They had these crops and animals in their wild repertoire. Humans very early on knew how to manage them and domesticate them. And they never looked back, I suppose.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about this because many times, if people would just kind of read history or ancient civilizations, it's always a Fertile Crescent in the Middle East. Yeah. It's East Asia, it's Mesoamerica, the Andes, all these places. And it's like, well, what is it? What's so special about the Euphrates and the Tigris River? Well, there's nothing really special about it in terms of the environment, the soil, the atmosphere, the all of the different things and how things were domesticated. Is that really the basis of it? It's an environmental solution of sorts.
Environmental. I mean, all of those areas where early agriculture became really important, they tend to have warm, temperate, or sort of tropical seasonal climates, because most of the big grains like wheat and barley, they're annuals. They need a seasonal climate where you have a wet season and a dry season. They don't grow very well along the equator or in Siberia. I mean, and so that's important. And the Middle East, I think, just Jared Diamond has pointed out, it is an intersection area of Europe, Asia, and Africa. So many species went into there and became available. And the large grain cereals and the major domestic animals, were native to what we call the Fertile Crescent. They were not native in Europe or say India or most of Africa. So that gave the people who lived there a major advantage. They probably weren't aware of it at the time, but the animals and plants that they were domesticating 10, 12,000 years ago were going to continue on to feed much of the world today. And the same with rice in the Yangtze Basin of China, and with maize, of course, one of the world's most important crops in originally Mesoamerica. It was taken very early to South America and then developed further through further domestication. And maize has a very complex history, but it's an crop even now. I think it's probably the most produced crop in the world. I'm not sure whether maize or rice take take the prize there, but one of them,
one of them is the first and second place for sure. It's a staple for most people groups still to this day.
Yeah. And pigs, chickens, and cattle, of course.
Sure.
Chicken, as I said, is interesting because that's not from Fertile Crescent or well, it could be from the far south of China, but I think the most recent DNA work on chickens suggests that they probably came from somewhere like northern Thailand. And of course, chickens are rather late. I'm not sure when they got to Europe, maybe in Roman times or a bit before, but they're not. Chickens were not part of the original farm cultures of places like Europe or the Fertile Crescent.
Yeah, talk a little bit. You talk about it in a few chapters, I think, 2 chapters, I think, maybe in the book, of what food production was like in the Yellow, Yangtze, and Liao regions in China. It's something that, again, unless you're a historian of China, a lot of people don't know about this. So you just chat about that a little bit.
Well,
and how is it similar? Sorry, to the Fertile Crescent? Again, this kind of seasonal thing, temperate weather.
It's a temperate latitude, similar latitude with a seasonal climate. In China, of course, the climate is monsoonal. That means that the rainy season, the growing season, is in the summer. In the Fertile Crescent, the rainy season is in the winter, which does make a difference to how you produce the crops. Of course, wheat and barley are winter crops. Started life as winter crops. Rice and the millets are summer crops. Now, China, the oldest successful agriculture was obviously in the Yellow River, where the main crops to start with were millets, foxtail and broomcorn, not rice. Rice was domesticated probably around the same time in the middle and lower Yangtze Valley, much further to the south. But of course, all of this area of eastern China is vast riverine plain, fertile alluvial soils, good rainfall. China also, of course, had wild pigs. They had domestic dogs. The early Chinese did not have things like cattle, sheep, and goats. They're Fertile Crescent animals. Chinese got them later, obviously, but in the Bronze Age, but not in Neolithic times. And the Yellow River and the Liao River, which is further north, developed these large villages of agricultural populations, dependent initially in that area on millets. They very quickly also brought rice from the Yangtze, but the original development was based on millet. In the Yangtze, it was rice. And as a result of that, population spread from the Yellow River. The people that we call the Chinese, who of course are complex with many languages nowadays, the Tibetans and the Burmese, they're all related. The Karen, many peoples in northern South Asia, in northern India, Bhutan, right round to the western side of the Himalayas. They speak what we call Tibeto-Burman and Sino-Tibetan languages that come from the Yellow River. Neolithic migrations starting 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. And all of this now is being tracked through very detailed ancient. The Chinese have suddenly discovered that in their museums, they've got thousands of skeletons and they have a lot of DNA. And I'm very frequently asked to review papers on this, where the geneticists will look at ancient DNA and come up with this record of movement starting partly in the Yellow River, also in the Yangtze, but most of the Yangtze people went south into southeastern China, whereas the Yellow River ones went up into Tibet and down through the western provinces of China into what are now Burma, western Thailand, and northern India. A vast movement of people. And of course, in this area, the archaeology of the record of villages, of domesticating these crops and animals like pigs and so forth, the ancient DNA from the bones, the linguistic. Now, I haven't said much about languages, but of course, linguists.
I was going to ask you. I was going to ask you about languages. I was going to ask you about that
because they compare languages as they're recorded. I mean, languages have to be recorded either as they're spoken today or a bit through written records, of course, going back in time. And they have statistical methods of trying to work out where the homeland was and in which directions the ancestral languages spread. And there are many methods of doing that, and the results are very interesting. What we call the Sino-Tibetan languages or did originate in the Yellow River Valley with these Neolithic people growing millet. I think that is almost certain. China's a very clear-cut and coherent area for this kind of a sort of cross-examination of different types of material from different disciplines to see how they relate. And in China, they do relate well. And they do in the Fertile Crescent as well. I was just going to say China, yes, has been, of course, as, you know, it is almost, I think India's beaten them now in population size, but China's always been one of the most densely populated areas on the planet. No doubt about it. It is incredibly fertile. It's huge rivers, the Yangtze, the Yellow, and the other big rivers. And of course, many populations in Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands, including Polynesians, their ancestral DNA has origins in the area that we now call China. It wasn't Chinese then, but I mean, the Chinese conquered China 2,000 years ago and built up the state that exists there now. But before that time, the enormous impact and very major migrations took place in China over thousands of years.
Yeah, this is so fascinating to think about it from those perspectives. So before languages, let's go over to the other side of the globe real quick. So again, you mentioned it. So if you want to expand upon it a little bit, is you talk about agriculture developing relatively independently. You can describe what that means. In the Central Andes, in South America, in the Northwest, in Mesoamerica, in the East Woodlands in the U.S. What does this relatively independently mean?
Of course, let's take the case of maize. The first people to cultivate and domesticate maize were probably living in the Balsas River basin in sort of western Mexico. And they might have, I mean, some botanists and geneticists think that maize might have first been domesticated because it's like sugarcane. It has sugar in its stalk, nothing to do with the cob. And the sugary liquid from the stalk was used for fermenting alcoholic beverages. I think, chicha is a kind of beer that's made from the cob, I gather. But, that's the general idea that people, and in China too, ancient people were very interested in alcoholic beverages and in the Fertile Crescent. I mean, wine, has a history of, I think 6,500 BC in Iran. This is one of the main reasons for domestication, not just to eat the food, but to make wonderful drinks out of it. And don't forget also, as one of my colleagues, Ian Gilligan, is always pointing out, domestication was also incredibly important for textiles, fibers like flax and other crops that produce fibers that you can make clothing from. That's another incredibly important reason for domesticating. But we were talking about maize, and relative. Well, maize was first cultivated and domesticated in Mexico, but very quickly, by about 7,000 years ago, people took it to Panama and right down into Peru. And maize is found in archaeological sites in Peru dating to, I think, about 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. I've forgotten the exact date. And also moving into the western part of the Amazon lowlands as well. And clearly the maize was taken down there initially, maybe by hunter-gatherers, I don't know, and people in different places continued to domesticate it. Eventually, the interest in maize became focused on the cob rather than the stalk. And of course, once the cob started to develop and become bigger, it became more and more productive. I mean, the ancient civilizations of the Americas were, as we know, the Incas, the Aztecs, and so forth, they depended on maize, very large cobbed maize, rather like modern sweet corn, that developed over time. But these people were in contact. I have no doubt about this. Ancient people, even before agriculture, people had boats. They got to Australia 55,000 years ago. Well, they must have crossed sea passages that were 80 or 90 kilometers wide. They had, we don't know what kind of boats they had, we never will, but probably rafts or something like that. Or boats made out of tree bark, there's some ways of getting around. People got around and for tens of thousands of years. So it's very difficult to say that something was invented in absolute isolation. I never quite believed that. Of course, the big issue here is contact between the Americas and Asia and Europe in ancient times. I don't think there was very much major contact because European and Asian language families, except in the Arctic zone, don't occur in the Americas. And the DNA report doesn't suggest massive influxes of people. But some contact is always possible. And in the case of maize, it's become recently very visible that the maize was moved thousands of kilometers by humans down into Peru very early on in its domestication history, long before major civilizations developed in Peru or Mexico. This was done very early on by, I suppose, developing hunter-gatherers who were emerging into agriculture. So that's where the idea of relative partly comes from. And in Africa too, we know that before the development of millet agriculture in what is now the Sahel zone of sort of Africa between the Sahara and the rainforest and savanna zones, but before that, a development of millet agriculture, there were already arrivals of sheep and goats from the Middle East. People had brought them, pastoral peoples had brought them through across the Red Sea and through into northeastern Africa before the millet farming, or at about the time the millet farming was developing. And I think there were connections here. Yes, people were people and spreading ideas, and I've little doubt about it. So a lot of
well, it's just very interesting because we still see all throughout the Americas how, corn is super much a staple of all of our food. I mean, if you go to anywhere in Latin America, you're going to have some kind of corn of some sort. You're going to have tortillas in Mexico and Central America, and is this interesting? You have it here in the U.S. and the other even in South America.
The other big crop is manioc, cassava from the Amazon region. That's enormous, and the sweet potato. If you travel around in Asia. In tropical Asia, especially in drier climates, you find those two crops are grown everywhere. I mean, because they're easier to grow than rice, and in dry climates, they're very hardy. And maize, maize, manioc, and sweet potato, three American origin crops, are becoming incredibly important across the rest of the world.
It's such an interesting story there. So let's talk about language. So obviously there's a big importance of languages, different languages evolving. Let me ask just generally about, I want to ask you about Anatolia, but so this will kind of connect here, but how instructive were the Mongols, and then you have the Ottomans after, and then you have, this is a little bit more recent, but this spread of language and how trade and religion play a part. What was this importance here of this?
I do go into this quite a lot in the 5-Million-Year Odyssey. Yes, I don't think these conquest empires ever spread any language. Alexander the Great conquered all over the place, all the way to the Indus River. But of course, a few hundred years after his death, and the kingdoms that followed him, everything was soaked up into the Asian linguistic landscape. Greek disappeared. It was the script was used for a while. The Greeks now, Greek is spoken in Greece, basically in Cyprus, basically, and of course in places, migrant communities in the USA and Australia. And the Mongols, huge empire, but Mongol has only ever really been, or the Mongolian languages, because there are more than one of them, only ever spoken, as far as I know, in the Mongolian region. And the same, the Romans were more successful because the Romans, like the ancient Chinese, they had this habit when they conquered a province, they would allow the members of the army who would have been from different parts of the empire, but all would have had to speak Latin to manage their lives in the army. They were given land to settle. And so, of course, Latin spread. As we know, Latin today is very widely spoken. I think of it as Latin, even though we now call it French and Italian and Spanish. Right. But it is still Latin. It's just living.
It's a Latin base.
They were successful. But most of the conquerors, and if you look, Alfred Crosby in his book Ecological Imperialism wrote very effectively about this many years ago. Countries like North America, Australia, New Zealand, the indigenous populations, unfortunately for them, I guess, were not very numerous in most areas. And of course, the Europeans poured in their tens of thousands in ship after ship after ship. and took the land. And as a result, the English language and Spanish in many parts of the Americas spread, replacing indigenous languages. But of course, in the areas of Asia where there were civilizations, and Africa and Europe, very dense populations, this didn't happen. So if you go to Indonesia, it was one time was a Dutch colony, you will not hear anyone speaking Dutch. And you don't hear people speaking Spanish in the Philippines. They do speak English a great deal. That's partly because of the American control of the Philippines in the early 20th century. And then you don't hear French spoken, of course, in the former Indochina. But you do hear a lot of English in Australia and the USA. And the reason why is very obvious. It's because people, mostly people with a farming way of life, settled in very large numbers and brought the language and established it. Genghis Khan and Alexander the Great didn't have enough followers to do that. Alexander didn't have enough Greeks, and many of the Greeks went home. They got fed up with it after they walked all the way to Pakistan, and they wanted to go home. Greek just disappeared, and it disappeared also in Egypt. Of course, the Greeks, the Ptolemies, controlled Egypt, and the Romans conquered them, and Greek eventually disappeared. Greek did survive in Turkey as in the Byzantine Empire until the Turkish the Ottoman conquest, but only in that area. So I mean, the moral of this story is that the kind of empires that we've seen in recent history that have involved colonial conquest and the maintenance of sort of cities like Jakarta, for instance, in Indonesia, port trading cities where a foreign elite managed a very large, widespread indigenous population. Those sort of conquests had no impact on language. Ones that did, unfortunately for the indigenous people, were the ones where the land was taken by settlers and permanent populations, vast numbers of them were established. And I think the same applies to prehistory. That's why farming is so important. It is a never-ending source of population growth. 8 billion people in the world today. Well, what do we live on? The products of domestication.
That's true. That's very true.
Without that, we wouldn't be here.
So tell us about this Anatolian hypothesis. I found this deeply fascinating. So many people will think about the Greeks and the Greek language, and it was very dominant for a while. Even if you start all the way, late Bronze with classical or ancient Greece and the 8th century BC. But if you go pre-Greek, you usually get to the Hittites, right?
In Greece, you get to the Mycenaeans, of course, who were Greek.
Yes.
Yeah, but the Hittites, their language, which died out in about 2,000 years ago. The Anatolian languages, I'm sure they also included the ancient Trojans. They must have spoken an Anatolian language. They were all over the region, the sort of central and western parts of the region that we now call Turkey. There were different languages in the Far East, and they disappeared. And this brings up a very important point that's worried me for many years. Now, I'm not a linguist, but I do read a lot of linguistic papers, and I can see what linguists are doing. Linguists want to work out, you have a whole group of related languages, let's say Indo-European. It's been known for 200 years that English and French and German and Hindi and Persian and Armenian and Greek and many others, of course, Russian, the Slavic languages, they're all related. They've got words in common. This was worked out in the middle of the 18th century. There's nothing new about it. They're related. So linguists want to know, and archaeologists too, where did they spread from? Now, linguists can only work basically with the data that has survived. Now, in the case of Indo-European, of course, the data include living languages as they're spoken now, mostly in the form of very widespread standardized state languages, which is not the prehistoric situation. Nowadays, the English language is unified. In AD 500, when the Anglo-Saxons were settling England, it was not. There must have been quite different dialects brought in from the continent. But But even so, where we know that all of these languages are related, they must have an origin, and it is thought to be a common origin. There's no other way of explaining it, because unrelated languages can't converge into a language family. Language families can really only originate and spread. There's no other explanation that makes any sense. So where do they spread from? Well, in the case of Indo-European, what has survived? There are two subgroups. A subgroup is a name for a closely related group of languages, that share an immediate common origin. Two subgroups. One of them is the Anatolian languages. That includes Hittite. The other one is a group now spoken in Western China, in Xinjiang, called Tokharian. The Xinjiang now, of course, is Turkic-speaking region, but the Tokharian was an Indo-European subgroup, and documents found in desert conditions dating to about 1,000 years ago record these Tokharian languages. Anatolian was totally extinct. I think it's mentioned in the Bible somewhere, and sort of Egyptian records talk about having a go at the Hittite kings and fighting battles and so forth. But in the case of the Hittites, of course, they had writing, and in their capital, Hattusas or Boğazköy in central Turkey, these tablets with cuneiform writing have been found, and it can be deciphered. And turns out that it is this Anatolian Indo-European language. What is more, in central Turkey, there is another site called Kultepe or Kanesh, which even earlier, around about 2000 BC, 1900 BC, had an Assyrian trading station from southern Iraq. The Assyrians were in central Turkey trading, and they also used clay tablets with cuneiform writing, and many of those tablets have been found. Of course, they're in the Assyrian language, which is a Semitic language, not Indo-European, but they do mention the names of people, which linguists think in many cases are of Anatolian-speaking people, Anatolian names. So we know about the Hittites through their writing, and we know about the Tokharians through their writing. But if we didn't have writing, and we didn't have it until the early 20th century for either of these groups, we would know nothing. And I'm just thinking here also of the Celtic languages. The Celtic languages still spoken in a very small way, of course, in Scotland, Ireland, Wales, formerly in Cornwall, and still, I think, in Brittany. They were once spoken all over Europe, according to place name evidence, and even into Turkey. They've disappeared. The Germanic and Slavic-speaking people and the Romans and their Latin have replaced them everywhere. We can read about this, in Julius Caesar, who conquered the Celts of Gaul. Now, this means, so this could be getting quite complicated, but it means that, that when linguists are analyzing a language family, they've only got the data that survive that they can actually see or read, either spoken or in recorded information. But many language families have huge segments that have obviously disappeared completely. Now, this has happened with Native American languages. With the arrival of European colonists, of course, vast parts of the USA really have no trace of their original languages. This includes the so-called Mississippian region around St. Louis, that big site of Cahokia. No one really knows what was spoken there. There's no indigenous language spoken on the spot now. And many areas of that part of the USA, which is very densely settled, of course, have no real good linguistic traces of the former situation. So, in other words, many of these language families have their roots have disappeared. They've disappeared because within the language families, some of the groups have expanded and cannibalized their relatives, if you like. They've spread. And this has happened with Anatolian, of course. The Greeks conquered Anatolia, and Greeks spread in during Greek times, and then, of course, joined the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire especially, and then Turkish, again, came in and spread over the top of all of that. So these subgroups have disappeared, and I know that the same thing has happened with many, many subgroups of families of languages in Southeast Asia. The Vietnamese and Khmer are related in the Austroasiatic language family, but vast areas of that language family have been overlain and completely replaced by the spreads of, first of all, Chinese and Sino-Tibetan languages, but also especially the Thai languages, which come from southern China. In other words, languages replace each other. Migration never stops. People are always moving, and things are being replaced. Now, if we didn't, back in the case of Indo-European, if the Hittites had never invented or borrowed their writing from Mesopotamia, which is what they did in reality, we would never really know anything about them. We'd have no idea.
Yeah.
No, and of course, there is a strong view nowadays that Indo-European languages spread from the steppes north of the Black Sea in the rather war-torn region of Ukraine and Western Russia. I'm happy to accept, and there's good DNA evidence that there were population spreads from here into northern Europe, north of the Alps, especially Scandinavia and England and Britain and northern Europe. But I don't think all of the Indo-European languages came from the steppes north of the Black Sea. Certainly not the Anatolian languages. And the ancient DNA also indicates that spreads from the steppes are important in northern Europe, but not in the southern. The Mycenaeans and the Minoans, whoever they were, the people of Crete, but also people in Anatolia, the Hittites, they did not have a steppe origin. Some linguists now think that maybe the Indo-European family developed first of all in what is now Armenia and then spread north to the steppes. I'm not sure. My view still is that with the Neolithic period in Europe, between 4,000 and 6,500 BC, there was a massive population replacement known from DNA and archaeology, and that is when the first Indo-European languages spread. But of course, many of them have been replaced. The ones that were there 5,000 years ago or 6,000 years ago are not there anymore. They don't have descendants because the Romans and the Slavic-speaking people in the Balkans and Eastern Europe and Germanic speakers, they've all spread, as we can see, with Celtic and Anatolian and Tokharian, and they've replaced what was there before. And that makes life very difficult. I mean, you can only reconstruct what is likely to have happened by giving equal consideration to language, genetics, and archaeology. It's very difficult to just take one of those disciplines and say that this is the one that gives the answer, and everything else is to be ignored. I can't see that. When I take all three into consideration, then to me it is the Anatolian region, what we call it Turkey now.
Yeah.
That is the region where these Indo-European languages originated 6,500 years, or 6,500 BC, actually, in terms of migration. But many of the earliest traces of their movements are no longer clearly surviving linguistically. It's very difficult to argue from data that don't exist. I know it is extremely difficult to argue from something that no longer survives, but sometimes it is very obvious that things don't survive. And then you have to think about the possibilities of what is most likely to have been the case, even though you'll never know for certain. We can never prove anything. We can't prove that Indo-Europeans came from anywhere at any time. It is all assumption. It's interesting assumption. And that's as far as we can ever go. But all we can go for is the most likely hypothesis. And for me, still, Indo-European started life as a Neolithic spread amongst early farmers coming out of the Fertile Crescent. And of course, since then, vast developments have swamped it and overlain it.
Yeah.
It's true.
Yeah, the Anatolian hypothesis is very, very convincing. I mean, again, when you start thinking about these regions, we have, from history in various forms, and there's a lot of overlap here, but we have obviously the Assyrian Empire, we have the Scythian Empire, we have places from people groups from the Caucasus region. Obviously, you have, Sumerian and Akkadian, and you have all of these different languages, Semitic and non-Semitic. And it's very instructive to see a lot of these, such as we were discussing, the Hittites in the Anatolia region, have now gone, extinct. But there are other groups as well, that have also from this region, the steppe, the Caucasus, kind of outside of Persia in Anatolia, that have also not known a lot of evidence or have been destroyed or whatever. And so it's interesting to see something that we might not know or very, very small fragments of, but could have had a tremendous impact on the languages we or currently speak now in those regions.
Well, I think this, of course, the steppes north of the Black Sea, Ukraine, Western, the Pontic steppes as they're called, I think certainly the evidence for Bronze Age, late Neolithic, early Bronze Age migrations across Northern Europe is extremely strong, and we can't ignore that. It happened, of course, after the Roman Empire as well, with all of the Goths and Vandals and Huns. Yeah. But don't forget, they never established any languages. I mean, they conquered all over the place, but their languages never got adopted. I suppose in the case of Germanic languages with the Anglo-Saxons, they were highly successful in England. But most of Europe, those languages were not picked up because there were too many indigenous people. In the case of the Pontic steppes migrations, well, yes, I can see it is possible that some of the northern subgroups of Indo-European, Baltic, Slavic languages might have spread from that region. I'm not convinced, actually, that I'm sure they migrated, but whether they replaced any language, like the case of Alexander the Great, or did they replace the languages? And because the Pontic steppe DNA is not found in large quantities around the Mediterranean, or even in most of India, except amongst the higher castes that may have had a Central Asian origin. I just don't think that it explains the whole picture. The Pontic steppe spread is a secondary one, I think. It's important, and it certainly had an impact on Northern Europe, but I think it followed the initial spread that I think was much older and did start from Anatolia and go through Europe and into other parts of the Middle East. And of course, eventually into South Asia as well, into India and Pakistan. There's languages there. Also European in the north.
Certainly, yeah. It's just deeply, deeply fascinating. So my final question here is: there's so many turning points in our 5 million year history. We have the separation from hominins, from chimps and bonobos, migration out of Africa, the genus Homo sapiens, food production, migrations, all these things. I guess the big question I have is, what would you say if you had to reduce it down to one or two major factors that are the most significant for humans, who we are, how we got to where we are today? What would you say about our 5 million year odyssey in that way?
Well, of course, there is the biological. Being bipedal, having a big brain, having hands that can play violins and things like that. The cultural, I think, of course, there is, having tools and knowing how to use them. But there is another factor. Well, there are two other factors. Of course, one of them is migration. Migration, I think, is extremely important. For many years, archaeologists, years ago, when I was a student, used to say, oh, nobody ever migrated, everything evolved, where it's found. I've never found that argument very impressive. But the other one, of course, is population growth. Migration and population growth go hand in hand. I mean, starving people are not going to migrate very far. And impoverished and disease-ridden people are not going to be successful migrants. Successful migrants were populations who had a strong food supply that they could carry with them. Yes, that's very important too, of course, being able to carry these domesticated plants and animals and plant them in completely different environments. That was a major part of it. But population growth and migration, they're two sides of the same coin, in my view. I think they were essential, as well as the biological side, and of course the linguistic. I mean, language. There are two sides. There's the physical side to linguistics. We can speak. We have hyoid bones and throats, and we have speech apparatus that other primates don't have. Other animals. But our languages are also major cultural creations. They're full of words that define the way people live and think. And so languages, yes, the biology. And the culturally driven population growth and migration, I think those are the answers. They're very generalized, but
No. But I think those are the
why we're here.
Yeah, exactly, absolutely. Well, the book is called The 5-Million-Year Odyssey: The Human Journey from Ape to Agriculture. This is out through the wonderful Princeton University Press, and it's absolutely fantastic. Peter, what can I say? This was such a delight. I'm so thrilled that we got to talk for so long and really give the history of humans and history of us. So I can't say enough thanks. So really appreciate you coming on and giving us all your wisdom.
Inviting me. I hope I've explained it clearly. I tend to get, of course, I'm not using notes or anything or giving a lecture. I'm just making it up as I go along. But I hope it's come through reasonably coherently. And it's an exciting topic. Yes, it's kept going for all of my career. And I'll keep going for some more, I think. Yes, I'm just revising another book at the moment about ancient migration. I'm trying to sort of think my way through it. Which will come out in a few years, no doubt. But,
well, big thanks. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And okay.
Absolutely.